Hello again. In The Real Jesus by F. Bruce, the chapter Jesus, the Historical Setting, page 35. The Jews of Palestine in Jesus' day. While Jesus was born in Bethlehem, he spent his boyhood and youth in Nazareth. In this Galilean town he was brought up with 4 brothers and an unspecified number of sisters, in the house of Joseph, the local carpenter or builder. Joseph appears to have died before Jesus emerged into public view. His wife Mary, Jesus' mother, lived on to become, with the rest of her family, a founding member of the primitive church in Jerusalem. It was no secret that the family could trace its ancestry back to King David. Jesus himself, however, laid no weight on this, although he did not repudiate the designation Son of David when others gave it to him. When Judea became a Roman province, the prefect chose Caesarea on the Mediterranean seaboard as his seat of government. It was largely a Gentile city, and for a Roman, a much more congenial place to reside than in Jerusalem. But in the eyes of Jews, Jerusalem remained the capital. It was indeed the religious center of Jewish life, no matter how widely dispersed throughout the world the Jews might be. Here stood the temple, God's one visible dwelling place on earth. King Herod had completely rebuilt it and made it one of the most magnificent structures of its time. Here and there alone the Jewish priesthood, here and here alone the Jewish priesthood functioned, offering up sacrifices to the God of Israel day by day and year by year. The head of all the Jewish priests was the high priest. Between AD 6 and 41, the high priest owed his appointment to the Roman governor. So this department of national life was as firmly under the control of Rome as all others. In addition to his sacred functions, the high priest, for the time being, was also president of the Sanhedrin, the supreme court of the Jewish nation, which retained control of internal affairs, although it was ultimately answerable to the Roman governor. It comprised 70 elders, in addition to the high priest. The majority of these elders belonged to the wealthy party of the Sadducees. The aristocratic families from which the high priest and leading temple officials were regularly drawn at this period were Sadducees. The Pharisees formed the minority group in the Sanhedrin, but their standing among the people was such that they exercised an influence out of proportion to their numbers. That's an interesting wrinkle if you're coming from a JW background like I do. You get the impression that Jesus' chief enemies were the Pharisees, but the Pharisees disappear from the account at the time of the trial. Interesting. The Sadducees do not figure significantly in the record of Jesus' ministry. With the Pharisees, on the other hand, he was involved in controversy almost from the beginning of his public activity. The Pharisees, in reaction against prevalent laxity, were concerned about the scrupulous observance of the Jewish law. They banded themselves together in local brotherhoods to encourage one another in its study and practice. Their number was reckoned to amount to about 6,000 at this time. Many people who were not themselves members of their party followed their direction. Most of the scribes, the professional students and teachers of the scriptures, belonged to one or another of the Pharisaic schools and popularized their teaching. But not all the scribes were Pharisees. There were others who expounded the law in accordance with Sadducean tenets, ignoring the tradition of the elders. The tradition of the elders was largely designed to adapt the ancient law to the conditions of a day far removed from that in which it had originally been given. If, for example, the fourth commandment forbade the doing of any work on the Sabbath day, it was necessary to define what was work and what was not in the Palestinian situation of the 1st century A.D. The accumulated body of adaptation and interpretation, which was transmitted by word of mouth, came to be regarded as a law code in itself, the oral law over against the written law, and in theory at least it was held to go back to Moses, who, it was affirmed, received it from God on Mount Sinai along with the written law. The Pharisees' meticulous observance of the laws of Levitical purity made it difficult for them to associate too closely, at table, for example, with their fellow Jews who were not so particular about such matters. They also took very seriously the practice of tithing, donating 10% of all income and produce to the service of God, to the point where they tithe not only major crops like barley and wheat, grapes and olives, but also garden herbs. Their unwillingness to eat anything of the sort unless they could be sure that the tithe had been properly paid on it constituted a further barrier to sharing meals with other Jews. Here was one marked difference between Jesus' lifestyle and theirs, for he was notoriously ready to enjoy table fellowship with people who had no foothold in respectable society. Now he talks about political issues in those days. During Jesus' ministry, the high priest in Jerusalem was Joseph, surnamed Caiaphas. He was appointed to the office in AD 18 by Valerius Gratus, a prefect in Judea, and held it for 18 years. When Pontius Pilate succeeded Valerius Gratus as prefect in AD 26, he left Caiaphas in occupation of the high priesthood. Probably he was given reason to think that it would be more to his advantage to leave Caiaphas in office than to replace him by someone else. Both he and Caiaphas were removed from their respective offices in AD 36 by Lucius Vitellius, Roman governor of Syria, under whose authority the prefect of Judea was. Caiaphas was a member, by marriage, of the most powerful of all the high priestly families in the New Testament era. He was son-in-law to Annas, who had been high priest from AD 6 to 15. When Annas was removed from office, he remained the power behind the high priestly throne for many years. 5 of his sons and 1 grandson, in addition to his son-in-law Caiaphas, occupied the high priesthood at various times between AD 16 and 68, so the time of the Jewish War. It was only in Jerusalem that Jesus came into contact with the high priest or the Roman prefect, and that in the closing days of his life. In Galilee he lived under the rule of the tetrarch Herod Antipas. Antipas was an astute statesman. It was not for nothing that Jesus once referred to him as that fox. That's Luke 13:32. He knew well that he owed his principality to the grace of the Roman emperor, and he made it his business to maintain the emperor's goodwill. Not once did he put a foot wrong until, in old age, he allowed his wife, Herodias, to persuade him against his instinct and better judgment to take action which resulted in his deposition and exile. The emperor expected him to preserve law and order in his tetrarchy, and he acted swiftly against anyone who seemed likely to become a focus of disaffection. John the Baptist suffered imprisonment and death on this account, and later the tetrarch's suspicions were directed against Jesus. But for one who lived beside the Lake of Galilee, as Jesus did during the greater part of his ministry, it was easy to escape Antipas's attention by taking a ship to the other side, to the territory of his brother Philip, where there were no such tensions as troubled both Galilee and Judea. About 4 miles north of Nazareth lay Sepphoris, where Antipas had his residence until about AD 22. He then moved from there to a new capital, which he built for himself at Tiberias, on the lakeside, and named in honor of the Emperor Tiberius. Reports of happenings at the Tetrarch's court would quickly be carried to Nazareth and other neighboring towns. Historic scenes of Israel's ancient history were within view of the hilltop overlooking Nazareth, and just as familiar to one who lived there were the realities of the nation's present plight. Nazareth might be a place of no great repute, a backwater off the beaten track, but its inhabitants were not insulated from current events. When the Holy Family returned there during Jesus' infancy, they would be told the full story of the troubles which had afflicted Galilee immediately after the death of Herod. The chief of those troubles was a rising led by a man named Judas, who with a band of fellow insurgents raided the royal palace at Sepphoris and seized the contents of the armory. Thus equipped for military action, they dominated the region and were not put down until Quirinius Varus, Roman governor of Syria, marched south with 2 legions to crush the revolt and pacify the land. The Roman idea of pacification was demonstrated by Varus's crucifixion of 2,000 ringleaders of the revolt. Their bodies remained fastened to the crosses along the main roads for a long time as a deterrent to others. 9 years later, when Judea to the south was made a Roman province after the deposition of Archelaus, news arrived at Nazareth and elsewhere of a rising led by another Judas in protest against the new order in Judea. This rising was crushed in its turn, but its ideals lived on in what Josephus calls the fourth philosophy, the doctrine, that is to say, that it was impermissible for the people of God living in the land which he gave them to hand over the produce of that land by way of tribute to a Gentile ruler. For now that Judea was an imperial province, its inhabitants were required to pay taxes to the emperor. Indeed, the new emperor, the new governor of Syria, Quirinius, held a census to determine the amount of taxation to be levied from Judea for the imperial exchequer. The people of Galilee, although they were not directly involved in this rising, would be the more keenly interested in it because its leader, Judas, belonged to the territory just across the lake of Galilee. No one, even in the remotest parts of Galilee, could forget the problems and conflicts raised by the Roman presence. The hope of liberation burned in the hearts of many, whether it was expected to come through divine intervention or by armed struggle. When Jesus launched his Galilean ministry by proclaiming release for the captives and liberation for the oppressed, he had to make it crystal clear that his proclamation was not to be realized by military or political means. Many of his hearers were slow to believe that he meant what he said. Even so, when he left the relative security of Galilee and ventured into the area of direct Roman rule, it was at the hands of the Roman power that he met his death. Next time, the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the ministry of John. I'll put in a link to how God used the greatest Caesar to pave the way for Christianity. This is based on observations of Michael Green in his wonderful book, Evangelizing in the Early Church. I think it's called Evangelism in the Early Church, but anyway, it's gone through a couple of editions, and it should be in everybody's library. See you soon.